Welcome, hello, welcome everybody who's coming in. This is Research Rally. This is the Institute on Critical Race and Ethnic Studies. I'll just give a couple more minutes here. Oh, wow, okay. So it is in speaker view now, right? Okay. Okay, welcome all. I just wanted to take a moment to let some folks in and welcome everyone, including our panelists today. My name is Dr. Marilisa Jimenez Garcia, and I am an assistant professor here in the Department of English, Latino Studies. Buenas tardes a todos que están aquí. Gracias por venir. Gracias por apoyar nuestra obra. I am also the principal investigator and founding director of the Institute on Critical Race and Ethnic Studies and the chair of our Education Justice Initiative. And this is Research Rally, okay? So why do we call it Research Rally? Well, instead of going to the flagpole to take a stand against injustice, we are here to offer our methods, our art, and our research as pathways pa'lante. This is our answer. And I wanna thank our supporters, one of them being my dad. I always thank my dad because he was one of the first people to really get behind Research Rally when we talked about it the first time. So Papi, I know you're listening, Brooklyn in the house. And also I wanna thank Balance that has been a big supporter of the Center or the Institute on Critical Race and Ethnic Studies, Gender Equity also, Center for Teaching and Learning, the College of Education, the Humanities Lab. Also want to shout out to Beth Dolan, Alan Snyder, Kate Bullard, Suzanne Edwards. Thank you for your support. So I'm just going to give a couple remarks before we start, and each one of us that's involved in the Institute will be giving a couple remarks before Dr. Nieto's keynote. And we're so thankful to have Dr. Sonia Nieto here with us. So the Institute began as a conversation between faculty of color and students in the Black Student Union and the Latino Student Alliance. I want to shout out to Kevalise Matthews Alvarado, who's actually here, okay? You're going to be hearing from her, and Ruben Rosas for their work in organizing for this institute. And Ruben created the logo you see in many of our materials. We knew that there was a need for an intellectual home at Lehigh for research centering the knowledge systems of people of color and the intellectual needs and experiences of faculty and students of color. A research institute which would create bridges across disciplines and colleges at Lehigh and create opportunities for formal research training, mentorship, and leadership. The Institute takes its name out of a desire to emphasize and learn from the collective and transnational struggles of US-based communities of color. We aspire to engage in research, teaching, learning, and policy grounded in anti-racism, anti-sexism, and anti-colonialism. We came up with that, by the way. If you hear somebody else say it, they took that from us, okay? But that's the three of us, the three things together, just remember that. So in spring 2019, we were awarded a small ideation grant from the Research Futures program out of the Office of Research. In summer 2020, during the COVID-19 crisis and the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, our institute became a popular phrase in many letters of solidarity for racial justice, even when we didn't have a budget going into the school year. Indeed, our institute was mentioned many times by students of color during the Black Lives Matter town hall on June 4th as a tangible way forward for the university to support Black students and faculty and shift its intellectual culture to the next level. After a tedious application cycle, in June 2020, our institute was awarded a major programs investment grant for us to begin building the many things we proposed almost 2 years ago, things like our data center and the Grad Amped Fellows program, which supports the retention of faculty and graduate students of color. However, we continually find ourselves in an uphill battle with the lack of formal infrastructure, commitment, and university support the intellectual work of racial justice requires at Lehigh. I want to say that if you signed a letter of solidarity during the summer, please take the time to stand with us beyond just symbolism and support our work at every level. We want to also say that we did not come to replace existing programs at Lehigh. We seek to provide new pathways forward which would retain our students and faculty and generate research on a local and national level, particularly focusing on our Black and Latinx and Afro-Latinx communities in the Lehigh Valley. We are part of a larger intellectual legacy, sometimes unseen at Lehigh, of brilliant students of color who have invented spaces like the M Room, Umoja, Lucy Scholars, etc. Our students figure it out and they get things done, and that should inspire us. We represent a history going back some 40, 50 years of students and alumni of color, leaders in their fields of business, science, and humanities, which represent the best of Lehigh that Lehigh has to offer. You see, regardless of what you're used to, we are Lehigh. I leave you with our motto: research, study, teach, action. I pass the mic to Syria Lang.
Thank you, Mary Lisa, and thank you everyone for joining us. We are really excited to be here, and to echo what Mary Lisa said, this is Lehigh. We too are Lehigh. The Institute of Critical Race and Ethnic Studies is Lehigh, and we are building on the legacy of our students that have done a tremendous amount of work to create space for scholars of color, for Black, Indigenous scholars of color on campus, and the Institute of Critical Race and Ethnic Study is existing because there is a need. There is something that is missing on campus. There's something that is missing in our different colleges. There's something that is missing in our different departments. And we are here to fulfill that need as part of our scholarly responsibility, as part of our intellectual responsibility to the communities to which we belong. And our work is grounding our own knowledge and our own information and our own learning in the lived experiences of people upon which our work bears relevance on our communities. Our communities include our students, our faculty, our staff, the communities close to Lehigh. We have built relationships with our local communities. We work with local organizations to figure out how we can improve the circumstances and conditions of people of color at Lehigh and people of color in the Lehigh Valley, in Bethlehem, in Allentown, and in Easton. So we seek to continue to build these relationships with the community. We seek to continue to build these relationships with everyone at Lehigh University that cares about racial justice, that tweeted that Black Lives Matter, that talked about dismantling white supremacy in June. This is the time for us to really take action, to go beyond just platitudes of our words, to support both financially and structurally the work that's coming out of the Institute and the scholars that do that work. We don't take for granted the fact that students come to Lehigh and don't expect to see people that look like Marilisa or people that look like me. We have a scholarly responsibility to serve as mentors for our students and to create a home for them in which they can thrive. And we really take that responsibility seriously. We thank the university for supporting us thus far, but there are still incredible gaps and barriers that we face. And we hope that we would begin to overcome these barriers and that support for the Institute would not just be all words. So I chair the Health Justice Collaborative, and part of what I do in the Institute is to put together a team of scholars. We just had a publication, Kevin List is on it, on the data set that we worked on, that we collected that has garnished a lot of interest, both media and policy attention around social stressors that are specific to communities that have been marginalized by structural inequalities and what that means for health outcomes. And we want to continue to build work that draws on the experiences, but that also includes and amplifies the voices of people that have been historically excluded and historically marginalized. Those voices are on campus. We are those voices, and we hope that you would help to remove the barriers that have actually prevented those voices from being heard. And we hope that people would not only listen to our work and care about our work and tweet about our work and talk about our work, but that they would support our work in terms of financial resources and in terms of structural resources so that we can thrive. Thank you so much. Kevelis, over.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kevelis Matthews Alvarado. I'm the grad assistant at the Institute for Critical Race and Ethnic Studies. First, I want to thank everyone for coming virtually. We really appreciate the support. And I think despite all the negatives and despite COVID and how terrible COVID is, I think it's opened the door for us to connect and kind of community build in unanticipated, but at the same time, beautiful ways. So I appreciate everyone coming together. And I just want to say, I want to challenge everyone to recognize the ways that our work both academic research, the frameworks, they're inextricably tied to activism. And that's why we kind of bring to you this event in the spirit of activism and recognizing that our work is not disentangled and not divorced from resistance to larger structures of power, but it is in that we are resisting and trying to not just make Lehigh a better place, but also Lehigh is a microcosm of, the larger world. So that's kind of our contribution. And I think goes beyond just the money that we have, finally gotten. It goes beyond just those financial support, and just the work doesn't stop there. So with that, I, again, want to welcome everyone, and I'm passing off the mic to Elisa, and then we'll get to Dr. Nieto. So thank you all for coming.
Hi everyone, I'm Alisa. I'm the undergrad assistant researcher at the Institute. Firstly, thank you everyone for coming and showing your support. I'm really excited to be able to do this research, and it's been amazing to be involved in the Institute. Of course, I echo a lot of the things Dr. Jimenez, Dr. Lang, and Kevali said. Otherwise, the poem I'm about to recite, it's largely based on the importance of the implementation of ethnic studies in our curriculums, to advocate for the ways communities of color are included in the way we learn, to humanize communities of color, to teach that these communities are not objects of study and not to be used as background noise. They hold valuable stories, histories, and sentiments, and I encourage you to further the fight for the implementation of curriculums that center communities of color. So with that, this is my spoken word poem, and it's called My Curriculum. My curriculum, because their curriculum is a little too used to the dehumanization of Black and brown bodies, a little too comfortable with bleak and unempathetic so-called conversation about the struggles that surround our ancestry. That curriculum that moves past the conversations that are real and raw and honest, conversations that paint pictures outlined with the blood of the people who apparently don't belong on the land stolen from them, moves past the conversations that are a little uncomfortable, too political. But not in my curriculum. And I didn't learn Shakespeare and Jane Austen the way I learned Gloria Naylor, Judith Cofer. In my curriculum, we leave space for people that don't fit your canon. Their stories just as valid, their stories life-changing, their stories representative of a larger struggle. Because we should learn Creole, Mestizo, and Mulatto just like how we learn European. We should learn the origin of the word Boricua and closely read Audre Lorde, Toni Morrison, Julia de Burgos, the myth of the Latin woman. I'm saying third world woman. And in my curriculum, I want to hear the different dialects, the sound of a tongue that seems lost, buried under a facade that deems it insignificant, that deems it textbook worthy, not conversation worthy, textbook worthy, not poetry worthy, textbook worthy, but not quite coursework worthy, the songs of a culture I never got to study, but could one day touch me, change me. I want them to fear my curriculum, fear the way it will hold open their eyes, dissect their preconceived notions, make them overflow with a newfound curiosity. In my curriculum, stories of furrowed brows and big hoops, strong curls, red lipstick, a little too aggressive for you. Spaces where we unpack and we see ourselves, where we yearn and yell and vent. And I don't know about you, but that's not aggression. In my curriculum, that's what I call healing, curación. And with all of these stories to share, diverse in meaning and color and tradition, in hair texture, in slang, in dance, and in art. Where do we lose? Tell me, where do we lose in learning about the culture that we never truly lost, but was rather just permitted to this gray area? A culture that serves as this background noise for glorified stories of colonization. I want to hear about the Congos of the Afro-Cuban community. I want to hear about Nuyorican voices, the diaspora, and the woman whose writing is a little too intimidating. a little too revolutionary for that curriculum. I want to hear about forgotten leaders, the women of the Young Lords Party, the Women's Union of Nigeria, stories of men stripped of their lives in the fight for a sense of comfort and protection in their own country. That's what I want in my curriculum. A history they deemed invaluable, but let me tell you, in my curriculum, we navigate these forgotten stories with a hunger, a determination, a plea to never for a second undermine the bodies that can teach you so much about change and struggle, triumph and beauty. Not in my curriculum. Thank you.
Wow. Wow. Thank you so much, Elisa. Thank you so much to each of you who spoke and who are part of our team. What am I going to say after that? Oh, I got to say, I have to introduce Dr. Nieto. Okay, I have to introduce Dr. Sonia Nieto, who I just want to say, and I said this morning, you know, if it wasn't for Dr. Nieto, I don't believe that I would really be here. And I can say that, you know, honestly, she's someone who believed in me when really nobody else did, and encouraged me to be my whole self and bring my whole self to everything that I did with intention and purpose. And I never had a Puerto Rican professor. I had obviously my mom, you know, my tias that were all teachers. So I know that I had a legacy of learning in my life, but I had never seen a professor that was a Puerto Rican, and I had never read a book by a Puerto Rican professor. So it was a huge deal for me when I first heard about it and read about it. And of course, to introduce her today is just so meaningful to her, for her to be part of this story with us. And so Dr. Sonia Nieto is a member of the National Academy of Education. She is a professor emerita of language, literacy, and culture, the College of Education at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her teaching has spanned early elementary through doctoral education, and her research has focused on multicultural education, teacher education, literacy, and the education of students of culturally and linguistic diverse backgrounds, with a special emphasis on Latino students. She is the author of dozens of journals. You know, the resume gets long, okay? And it's awesome, but especially including a memoir, Brooklyn Dreams, My Life in Public Education, Harvard Education Press, 2015, and co-authored a book with her daughter, Alicia Lopez, Teaching a Life's Work, a Mother-Daughter Dialogue, Teachers College Press, 2019. A lot of us also know the book, Affirming Diversity, which has been, I mean, so many editions at this point. Affirming Diversity, the Socio-Political Context of Multicultural Education. And I'm so thankful to call her my mentor and my profesora. So welcome, Dr. Sonia Nieto.
Thank you so much. I'm just thrilled to be here. And, you know, this is this group that you have is just incredible. I wish that all of us have had, you know, that kind of mentorship, because all of you are being mentors to the new generation that's coming along. You know, all of you, Marilisa, Alyssa, Siri, and Kevalis, are a metaphor for what ethnic studies is about. And so I'm just very happy to be here. So today I'm going to share my story, and here I'll go to my, let's see. I think you have to put me on speaker view, don't you? And then I can.
You're on speaker view?
Wait, let me see. Okay, do you see my slides there? Hello?
You hit share screen.
Yeah, I thought I had done that.
No worries, take your time.
Share screen. Yeah. I did share screen.
Yeah, you shared it.
And so how come it's not coming up? Oh dear. There it is. Okay. So this is, I will mostly be speaking from my slides. This is, the title of my talk today, Advancing Critical Education Through Ethnic Studies. And these are my grandchildren. So I like to start with, a representation of what I'm all about. And that's what I'm about. So I wanted to start with my story of ethnic studies, from invisible and silent to visible and vocal, and just share some early photos. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, and this was before, my first photograph there is before I started school, where I spoke only Spanish at home, and I was immersed in a Puerto Rican, community and life. This is me as a fifth grader, I believe, again in Brooklyn, New York, where I had learned English by this time and where I never saw myself in the curriculum, Alyssa, or in the books or anywhere else. Then I became a teacher, and I taught at my second teaching job was at PS 25 in the Bronx, and that changed everything for me, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I was recruited to Brooklyn College in the Puerto Rican Studies department, and that's where my ethnic studies journey really took off. I decided then that I wanted to be a professor, because I had been an instructor at Brooklyn College and loved it, and decided that this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. So I went to UMass to study, and finished in 1979, and in 1980, a year later, I became a professor there, and I spent the next 25 years there. I highlight Affirming Diversity, as did Marilisa. That was my first book, and it changed my life, and I'll say a little bit about that. And then, and now I'm a professor emerita from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. So how did I become mute? And this, most of this is from my memoir, Brooklyn Dreams, My Life in Public Education. I lost my voice when I started school. I had none of the words that mattered, that is, the English words. I was lost. I wrote about this feeling in a chapter for a book by Maria de la Luz Reyes, Words Were All We Had, that chronicles the biliteracy journeys of Latino and Latina academics in their youth. I guess I hadn't learned how to tie a bow before I started school. I don't remember. What I do remember was feeling mute. I had just started school, and there I was, a 6-year-old in a first grade classroom in a rundown ghetto school in Brooklyn, trying to tie my hat. Evidently, I hadn't learned how to tell my teacher that I needed help, and so I stood there gesturing and making sounds that made no sense to her. She couldn't help me. I felt helpless. And my teachers made it clear to me over the years through my actions and words that continuing to speak Spanish would hinder my progress. I also became invisible in school. And my question, is what happens when you don't see yourself in the world? I think it's a profound question that many of us have lived through. So here's the writer, Adrienne Rich, saying it far more eloquently than I could have. When someone with the authority of a teacher, say, describes the world and you are not in it, this is a very famous quote that just speaks so poignantly to me, and you are not in it, there is a moment of psychic disequilibrium, as if you looked in a mirror and saw nothing. Yet you know you exist and others like you, that this is a game done with mirrors. It takes some strength of soul, and not just individual strength, but collective understanding, to resist this void and to stand up demanding to be seen and heard. And that's what all of you are doing. And that's the importance of ethnic studies. So this is something that I eventually learned to do, but it took some time. But I was also invisible in books. And I want to tell you a little bit about this book that many years after that first experience just stopped me in my tracks. Elaine Castillo, who's the author of America is Not in the Heart, wrote the foreword to a recent edition of the 1946 classic America is in the Heart by Carlos Bulosan, a Filipino. It's a quintessential American story of immigration, not the traditional story of the American dream, but a story of loss and pain. She captures this idea of erasure when she writes the following in this foreword that she wrote for his book. Do you remember how old you were when you first read a book that had a character who looked and lived like you in it? Maybe the first book you read was like that, and every book after it since. And you've never had to wonder about finding yourself, finding someone like yourself or the people who made you in books. You've always been right there at the center, unquestioned. Maybe someone you loved, a parent, a teacher, a librarian, gave you the book, with all the ceremony of an heirloom being passed down, extending a hand to save you because they too had once been saved in that way. Maybe you came to that book entirely, maybe you came to that entirely and later in life, and wish you had come to it younger, without so many of your scars. Maybe you still sometimes wonder about the kind of person you might have become if you'd found its pages back then. Maybe you never found the book at all and resigned yourself to the shape of that absence. Maybe you stopped looking altogether. When I read those words, it really struck me. I said, this is what so many of us have been feeling. So what I would say is don't stop looking for yourself in books. In fact, make your own books. This is the void that ethnic studies can help fill. So, it's a question to ask yourself. When did you find yourself in a book for the first time? For me, I finally saw myself in a book when I was 26 years old. After I was married, had a child, had been teaching for 4 years, and had completed a master's degree. And so then I went to PS 25, and everything changed after that. PS 25 is the bilingual school in the Bronx. It's still standing. It's no longer a fully bilingual school, but it was revolutionary at the time, 1968. So I want to tell you what it was like to be in a school where all of a sudden everybody spoke Spanish, from the principal to, all the teachers, all the kids. Everyone spoke Spanish and English to some extent. Everyone was bilingual to some extent, or becoming bilingual, which is, we are all in the process of becoming bilingual. And so it was a very empowering place. And about, I would say, a third of the teachers were Puerto Rican. The others were other Latinos and Latinas and African Americans and white teachers as well. But everybody had to at least be bilingual. So what did I learn in that school? I learned to challenge deficit discourses. And I'll say a little bit about each of these things. I learned to ask what I've called profoundly multicultural questions. To question whose standard and who says. To understand that language is an asset. Oh, to understand power, of course. And to recognize that language is an asset, a legacy, and a treasure that we should not forget. But not to feel guilty if you've forgotten your native language, because it's not your fault. It's really an important lesson. To understand that children and students of all ages need to see themselves in school and in the world, and that our responsibility as educators is to create a sense of belonging and inclusion in schools and classrooms and community and in the nation. So what do I mean by deficit discourses? That bilingualism is a handicap. Somehow we go to school and we are in the process of becoming bilingual and we are seen as deprived. That's a deficit discourse. to say, I don't see color. All students are the same to me. As a teacher educator, I've heard this so often. Because if teachers don't see color, they don't see us. That being raised by a single parent is a handicap. Now, I know that it's hard, but it's not necessarily a handicap. It can make you strong in ways that you might not have imagined. I was talking to my daughter today, who's a single parent and has 4 kids in school and is working and is going to school. And she called me to show me how she had set up each of the kids with their own computer to start the school day and then go to work in her bedroom. That standard means better, and it doesn't. And that poverty is destiny. So many of us come from a background of poverty, but not poverty of ideas and not poverty of feeling. So those are some of the deficit discourses. I want to share this picture too. This is my father with the 3 of us kids. And I think every teacher should have this, posted. No language is inferior. No culture is a culture of poverty. No child should be invisible and no community should be insignificant. So what do I mean by profoundly multicultural questions? I was asked to write a book about culture. And I think sometimes culture can be a very soft thing. People think, oh, that's their culture. They don't really, they're not devoted to learning. That's just part of their culture. And so I resisted that. And I said, well, let me write an article in this magazine, a very widely read magazine in education, on profoundly multicultural questions. If you want to know what's multicultural, you should ask questions such as, who's taking calculus? Because calculus, not that everybody has to take it, but it is one of those things that people think that certain kids can't do. Which classes meet in the basement? Over the years, as a teacher educator, which were the programs that met in the basement? The bilingual program, the special education program, yet nobody ever thought of putting the gifted and talented program in the basement. So it says something about the status that those programs have. Who's teaching the children? Why is it that in schools in poor neighborhoods, so many of the teachers haven't been prepared to teach children who look like us? And so they may go in with tremendous enthusiasm and commitment, but if they haven't had the experience, if they haven't been well educated, we have to ask that question. Who's teaching the children? How much are our children worth? How much is spent on their education compared to the education of more privileged children? That is a disgrace in our country, that even in public schools, the ones that are better heeled get more resources, a lot more. I learned to say, who said? And that came from my educational leadership article. So something else that I learned at PS 25 and beyond was whose standard and who says. So in his book with Irish Shore, Paulo Freire, that if you haven't read Paulo Freire, that's part of your education. You must read Paulo Freire. And that was Paulo. He asked the question, which, I always go back to. Who named the language of the elite as the correct, as the standard? And he answered his own question. He said, well, they did, of course. But why not call it upper class dominating English instead of standard English? An important question to think about. So I want to spend a little time on, mentioning some of the benefits of ethnic studies as someone who, who was at the beginning of ethnic studies in this country in 1972 when I went to Brooklyn College. What I've learned what I learned there, what I've learned since then. Ethnic studies allows people to be seen and heard. What all of you said before I came on, I think attests to that. You are seen and you're heard, and you're making sure to be seen and heard. It challenges the kinds of deficit discourses that I mentioned. It creates a different narrative. You are now in the story. You are part of the story. It unleashes learning. I know for me it did. It just opened up a whole world of difference. At the same time, it can create solidarity with others, because ethnic studies doesn't mean that then you are only enmeshed in your own world and that that's all you care about. For me, it's about creating solidarity. Because the more I became involved with ethnic studies, the more multicultural education became important to me. And so I had to learn about people of other backgrounds and about their lives and their histories, which are also hidden in our curriculum, in so much of our curriculum. So my introduction to ethnic studies came in the Puerto Rican Studies Department at Brooklyn College. I was hired there in 1972 after I had taught for a number of years in public schools. And it was definitely a time of struggle, a time of change, a time of discovering my own voice. And I wrote in Brooklyn Dreams, when I left the interview at Brooklyn College that fateful summer day in 1972, I was trembling with excitement because I walked out as an instructor. My interview lasted 3 hours, and it was almost all undergraduate students interviewing me. I thought about Papi and Mami, my mother and father, thinking, wait until I tell them, they won't believe it. I was really filled with gratitude for them when I walked out, knowing how much they had sacrificed to make it possible for me to get to this point. I thought about Papi's 16 to 18-hour days at the bodega. My mother's struggles with Freddie, my brother, who was autistic, and devoted her life to him, and about everything that they had given so that Lydia, my sister, and I could have the opportunities that they had never had. So landing a job at a college had been a lifelong secret desire, although I didn't necessarily know that I had that desire until it happened. But I was shocked that it was happening. I was 28 years old. I can't tell you how much I felt like a fish out of water when I started my job at Brooklyn College, because unlike most faculty, I didn't have a doctorate. Although at Brooklyn College in the Puerto Rican Studies Department, there were 8 of us. 4 of us did not have our doctorates, because at that time, there were almost no Puerto Rican doctorates at the time. So I hadn't been apprenticed into academia through a doctoral program, and I knew very little about what it meant to be an academic, a scholar, a researcher, or an intellectual. I was hired to be part of the bilingual program, so to prepare teachers. That I knew about. But what didn't I know how to do? I didn't know how to organize courses, prepare syllabi, what to do during office hours, what it meant to serve on departmental or college-wide committees, how to do research, how to publish. So these were all new to me. Nearly all the other members of the faculty outside of my department were older white males. Throughout the entire college, there were just a few women and a smattering of people of color. My advice to myself during those early years in academia was, you belong here just as much as everybody else does. But it took me some time to grow into that advice, to become more comfortable. My husband's advice to me, which I often repeat to everybody else, when I went in for that interview at Brooklyn College, he said, sensación de poderío. Enter with a sense of power, or I like to translate it into English as walk in as if you own the place. And that helped me. And it's helped me ever since. wherever I went, whether sitting on a panel with Rosa Parks in 1983, which I couldn't believe, or being awarded the 9 honorary doctorates that I've been privileged to receive. Politically, working at Brooklyn College was a baptism by fire. I thought I had learned a lot in the turbulent climate of the late 1960s and the early 1970s, but it was nothing compared to what I was to experience at Brooklyn College. So the 3 years that I was there are a blur of on-the-job political education, rallies, you know, real rallies, not academic rallies, not research rallies, demonstrations, takeovers, and even an arrest. This is the result of the growing pains of ethnic studies. It was a new and untested interdisciplinary endeavor, and we were creating it as we went along. There were powerful vested interests against it, and that is still the case, I know. Why is that? Because ethnic studies at its core is a direct challenge to higher education's Eurocentric curriculum, its epistemology, traditions, and tastes. New and critical voices were now contesting the previously agreed upon notion of what it meant to be an educated person. It was no longer limited to William Shakespeare, William Faulkner, and Ernest Hemingway. The new curricula included Toni Morrison, Pedro Pietri, Julia de Burgos, and many others. I also learned that ethnic studies is about learning or relearning the history of one's people and about other people as well. History was no longer simply about the conquests and achievements of Europeans and white Americans. It now included the study of imperialism, colonization, exploitation, and patriarchy. So my political, social, and cultural awareness took a giant leap forward that year, 1972. At Brooklyn College, I was introduced to the history of Puerto Ricans in New York and the Northeast. I learned that we weren't just victims. We were doers, creators, initiators. That was an important lesson to learn. Ethnic studies is based on a more collaborative and communal view of teaching and learning. As I mentioned, I was interviewed mostly by students, undergraduate students. They were instrumental in all curricular, personal, and other decisions in the department, and nothing like it had been seen anywhere until that time. Students served on all departmental committees, and indeed, sometimes they were the chair of those committees, often outnumbering faculty. I also learned to get out of my comfort zone. For me, it meant expanding the definition of what is an academic. I learned to speak up. I learned to participate in rallies and demonstrations, to sign petitions, to speak at those demonstrations, to serve as a member of various negotiating committees when we took over a different department, different offices. I was always on the negotiating committee for some reason. So I also learned how to serve as a member of various other committees. So these were all alien activities to me. It was a remarkable learning experience in other ways as well. I learned what life in academia was like, although I knew even then that ours was not the typical academic experience. That came years later. Taking part in political education, attending and learning to speak at our almost weekly demonstrations, taking over offices aren't usually associated with academia, though they were for us in those years, because we knew we had to do things that would get the attention and support of the people in power. I also learned skills that aren't necessarily regarded as consistent with academic life. I became adept at speaking in public, not at professional meetings, like at, the Puerto Rican Studies Association or the American Education Research Association to present my research, but at rallies on the Quad. We organized so many demonstrations that we joked we should start a business that in those years probably would have been quite lucrative. We wanted to call it Rent a Demo, where we would pile poster paper, magic markers, bullhorns, and other paraphernalia associated with political activism into the trunk of a car and go around the city renting it to organizations and groups that needed all of these things, because the city and the country were really on fire at that point. I also learned to understand that power is at the core of all academic and scholarly decisions, and learning how to use that power. So of course I learned the words of Frederick Douglass. Power concedes nothing without a struggle. It never has, and it never will. Important words for all of us to know. Our most important campaign was to have our colleague Maria Sanchez named as chair of the department. She did not have a doctorate, like, half of us did not have a doctorate. And so the administration brought in someone from Puerto Rico who they wanted to install, and we wouldn't have it. So we did everything from marching outside the president's office to signing petitions to marching and chanting on the quad. I had to learn to become more courageous than I'd ever been. But feeling that it was time, so this is now the story of I'll get out of, let's see, I'll have to stop the share from here. Right, okay. So feeling that it was time to make a big statement, we decided to take over the registrar's office. The staff members of the registrar's office were stunned and nervous as 200 of us marched into the offices of the registrar, asking them to vacate their offices. We promptly set up operations, settling into different rooms with different responsibilities. Refusing to leave the offices, we defied a temporary restraining order from the New York Supreme Court. All faculty members and dozens of our students, as well as students and faculty from other progressive organizations on campus, participated in the takeover. Newspaper reporters, camera crews, and television reporters were on campus daily. Outside in the hallway, there was a constant picket line in support of our action from people throughout the university, including my daughter, who was 3 years old at the time. People from around the city brought us food, blankets, and other provisions. People from around the nation called and sent us telegrams of support. We joked that our takeover was a strictly Puerto Rican affair. Not only did we not destroy any records, and that was happening in a lot of campuses where the students would take over and destroy the research and the records of all the faculty and of the administration. And not only did we not do that, but we swept the floors and took out the garbage daily. We even brought in an iron to press our clothing. I remember one student insisting on having a perfect crease in her jeans because without it, she said she simply couldn't go to the daily demonstration. In a word, we left things exactly as we found them and even better. Staff members from the registrar's office remarked that their offices had never looked so good. The takeover lasted 4 days. I was among those who remained for the duration, sleeping on a blanket at night as Angel went home with Alicia. Each day we braced for the arrest that we knew were coming. At 4 a.m. on the 4th day, Thursday, October 24th, 1974, 20 deputy sheriffs and 25 armed police officers showed up. We had, of course, practiced our response. We marched out, fists in the air, shouting, "Black, Latin, Asian, white, for our rights, we will fight." I was arrested as one of 3 faculty members and 41 students, and from that moment on, we became the BC 44. So now I'll go back to sharing my screen. Okay. So that is a picture that came out in the newspaper in the Kingman our Brooklyn College newspaper of me with my fist in the air, being arrested. We were released several hours later. We went back to Brooklyn College, and to our amazement, we were met by a boisterous crowd of about 2,000 on the quad. We greeted them with a new chant that we had made up in the subway on our way back to the college. We said, BC 44, we've come back to give you more. The response was deafening. I was asked to speak before this very loud and enthusiastic crowd, and my remarks, like those of the other speakers, were met with thunderous applause. Within a few months, the administration agreed to appoint Maria Sanchez as our chair. However, during those years, let's see, I want to stop share again. Okay, during those years, I never did research, and I never published an article. I presented my work at one conference. There was simply no time for any of that. So this is also a lesson that while it's important to do this political work, you also have to take care of the intellectual work. So I don't recommend this as a way to become an academic. At the time, it was probably the only way. I wish I could say that our early struggles at Brooklyn College had yielded some important gains. True, most Puerto Rican studies departments have in fact survived, but their existence has always been precarious. And that the same is true of African American studies departments and of other ethnic studies departments, indigenous studies, even women's studies, although to a lesser degree, I think, but I may be wrong. But their existence has always been precarious, and they've had to struggle for legitimacy and recognition even today, so many years later. In terms of CUNY, the City University of New York that Brooklyn College was a part of, while the number of Puerto Rican and other Latino students at CUNY colleges have grown substantially since those years, the same is not true of the number of faculty throughout the CUNY system. The year with the highest number of Puerto Rican faculty was 1975, the year after our takeover, which mobilized the whole city, all of the ethnic studies, not just ours. At that point, there were 245 Puerto Ricans on faculty. By 2002, there were only 131. At Brooklyn College, specifically, the Puerto Rican tenure-track full-time faculty represented 1.9% of the total faculty in 2002. So Puerto Ricans have, in fact, fared worse in terms of faculty representation than any other federally protected group. So I want to end with some of the changes that I experienced and that I think, happens to people who experience this kind of incredible change when they go through a period like this. I happened to be really privileged. I was at the beginning of bilingual education in this country, of Puerto Rican studies, ethnic studies, and multicultural education. And all of that has been incredibly enriching and also challenging. So my whole outlook on life has changed as I developed a more critical consciousness about life, education, culture, and politics. I could no longer watch the news on TV or read anything without thinking about the political implications. Issues of colonization, patriarchy, and race would always be on my mind, particularly as they related to education. I learned to be more courageous, more direct, less afraid of upsetting the status quo. Since then, I've continued to take part in more than my share of demonstrations, rallies, and picket lines. I've signed numerous petitions, contributed financially to international local organizations, and held signs for local candidates from school committee in Amherst, Massachusetts, to presidential candidates Jesse Jackson and Barack Obama. I've supported with time, money, and legwork many organizations focusing on social justice and equity. And I've served on as advisory board members or trustee on numerous boards working for a more inclusive and just society. And none of that would have been possible without my entry into ethnic studies. My growing consciousness also made it clear to me that although at the time I might not have had the language to adequately express it, that social justice, equity, diversity, and access have defined my life's work. My focus became then, and has ever since then, been the education of students for whom the US public education system has not worked equitably. And my goal has been to help change that. And that's my ethnic studies story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nieto. I'm gonna see if I can, I'm gonna change it to gallery view. Let me see. Yeah. Okay. Can we all see each other?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. So I think, we do have some questions, but not too many, but I wanted to see if within our own group, if we have any direct questions after hearing this presentation from Dr. Nieto in terms of the things that she's learned, the challenges she's faced, the direct actions she's taken on campus, right? I'm wondering if our students even have some experiences that they could speak to, also being involved on our campuses in different ways. Dr. Lang as well, right? We've certainly been at our share of rallies at Lehigh, including this new version, which is the sort of research rally. Just wondering if anyone within the panel wants to say something or wants to contribute a question or comment.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Nieto. I really appreciate everything that you said. One of the things that is sitting with me, hearing you say, is that you should keep searching for yourself in books. And you said, well, write your own book.
Yes.
How do you navigate instances where I think the gatekeepers of book publications, I don't want to see you tell a story or write your book. And I'm not, I think I'm partly some sociologist and I'm a health services researcher. Mm-hmm. And in sociology, people tend to write books. In health services research, people don't tend to write books. They do publication, journal articles. Right. And I have had pushback from editors, about some of the work that I do, yeah. As if experiential knowledge is not legitimate. It's not a legitimate form of knowledge. As if being a Black scholar or a scholar of color, in some ways harms my work about Blackness and about race. Yeah. In your career, did you experience similar things, and how did you navigate that? What advice would you give to more junior scholars?
I would say, first of all, don't follow my example, because these are different times. So you don't, well, maybe you will have to take over offices, but that's not necessarily the way to get ahead. I mean, there are many more pathways now for young scholars and for university students to demand change. So that's the first thing that I would say. Find mentors. That's really, really important. It's like I say to new teachers, look, go, when you become a new teacher, you're fresh out of college, you're 22 years old, you've never really taught before, you're assigned to a school, find the best teacher in the school, because everybody knows who that is, and say, will you mentor me? And I would say the same thing for, scholars who are starting out, because they open doors in a way that you won't be able to. I would not have been able to. I mean, after I wrote my first book and it was very successful, all of a sudden, all these editors came knocking at my door, wanting me to write books for them. So it wasn't that I had become great all of a sudden, that that people just saw that I had been able to do something that they could use. And so, so one thing that I would say is make sure to go to conferences where you can meet the people in your field and you can, start networking. That's really important. And now, even though you may not think that there are a lot of people like you in your field, go to those conferences and you'll see that there are more than you thought. So I think that's important. Network, make sure you join professional organizations. I did not do that because we didn't have those then. We didn't have them. And so we had to create our own. One story that I think about a lot is that when I went to my first American Educational Research Association conference, so you'll hear me mention AERA, it now has like 30,000 members from, all over the world, mostly the United States. And I went the first time to present my research, 1980. And I swore I would never return because it was so alienating. Puerto Rican? No, there were no Puerto Ricans. I mean, I didn't, I couldn't connect with anybody there. And even all the presentations that I went to didn't speak to me, to what I was interested in. Issues of social justice and diversity, they weren't there. That was 1980. In 1988, my friend Maria Torres Guzman, who was a professor at Teachers College, was getting there was a committee at AERA called the Committee on Minorities in Education. It's since been changed. It's called Committee on Scholars of Color in Education. But she was getting the award for the young scholar. And I went to, so she invited me to that. And so I decided, let me give it another chance. So 8 years later, I went back to AERA and I went to that breakfast to honor the emerging scholar, the, it's really like the young, the middle, and the old, and I was blown away. First of all, I looked around and there were all these people who all of a sudden had, come out of nowhere, people of color who were at this, and they were being celebrated. And it made me cry. It really did. Because first of all, I felt cheated that I had not met these people and had not known them or known the work that they do. But also that, it was so moving to me to hear them talk about their work. So make sure that you get into those places and don't be turned off like I was for so many years, because, just 8 years. And then I've only missed one or two since 1988. So it became important to me because then I said, you know what? There's a place for us here. And we have to make sure to create those spaces. So that's what I would say to you. And if you look at AERA now, it is completely unrecognizable from what it was like in 1980.
Thank you so much.
We have a few questions for us, actually, and also for Dr. Nieto. I'm wondering if we should start maybe with Dr. Nieto first, and then We have some
Oh,
people
take
who are
questions
take
for
questions. Okay, she says to
Yeah.
take questions.
Yeah.
Well, we have this question. I'm wondering what we all think about. What types of institutional systemic resources does the Ethnic and Critical Race Studies Institute need at Lehigh to be successful? Any thoughts on that? Anything in particular? I was thinking, I mean, I would maybe answer a little bit, but I was thinking something that would be helpful would be an actual budget within Lehigh University, as opposed to a grant, right? Which is sort of like more temporary for, you know, more of a 2-year kind of pilot program. You know, and I think there are some questions about sort of like, are we a new program? Are we a new, you know, we're creating this new thing. And I think what we really are in terms of supporting research and supporting programs. So you heard me say that we're not here to replace, you know, we're here to support, but specifically to provide research opportunities for students and for faculty that I don't see that particularly happening in this focused way. And also to generate research at Lehigh so that we can create policy and, you know, create and gather data and have it really focused within Lehigh, as opposed to sort of depending on, you know, outside, you know, kind of speakers coming in and speaking about a big, you know, situation that's happening, that we could be and have more support as scholars where we are. So I think that that's something I would like to say. We have had conversations with the provost's office also, and I think that's something that I would like to follow up with, definitely in terms of hearing more about what their intentions are in terms of supporting us as an initiative. But that's one thing I thought. I don't know if anyone else has something to say or if I said everything. So Dr. Nieto, we have a question here that says, what is the hardest challenge and reward in being a scholar?
You know, I talked about that this morning for a few minutes. And for me, the realization came maybe, you know, just a few years ago, that I realized that the greatest reward that I've gotten is through mentoring.
Mhm.
And so I encourage all of you, not just those of you who are here, you know, as panelists, but everybody who's listening and watching, to be a mentor. You never know what that does until you do it. And people come years later and say, you know, you changed my life, or I never thought I could do this, and now I'm doing this. You know, be a mentor, and not in a formal sense necessarily, but in an informal sense. See it as the way to give back, because all of us here in this space are very privileged now. Not like my parents were privileged, not like, you know, many of us come from parents who didn't have a formal education and not very many privileges. Not that they didn't deserve them. And so it is our way of saying, this is what's important to us.
We have another question that's sort of like more general to also Lehigh, which I think we could also think about here, but, and I think our students could talk about this also, like why did we choose critical race and ethnic studies as opposed to, you know, why do we say that we're different from just Africana studies, for example, at Lehigh, or Latino studies, right? So would someone maybe, I'm wondering if Kevalise would like to answer that. I don't want to put you on the spot, but in terms of thinking of when we were doing the proposals back in the day and sort of thinking about like the barriers we saw, right, between wanting to study certain kinds of things and not really having a collaboration. So I don't know if you wanted to talk about that.
We're positioning ourselves as an institute to kind of go beyond the typical structure of these programs, kind of siloed, separated, especially interdisciplinary studies. As a student, I can tell you from my experience in undergrad, it felt very separate, like we're all talking about the same sort of thing in our different segments. So one in Latin American Latino studies, same in Africana studies. And it almost, to me as a student, I was like, don't we know that we're all talking about like the same thing and we're all kind of trying to get at similar things, but there is no kind of conversation between the programs. And, you know, I think as the Institute, we wanted to center research and come together as a space to hold and create the space that we felt was lacking, to say, oh, we're all talking about anti-racism, we're all talking about ethnic studies and critical race theory. How can we create a space to not only build community, but specifically build community around research and carve out that space at Lehigh, because it's important. And I think that's kind of how we're a little different than the programs, but also trying to work in tandem with the programs and serving as a way to connect faculty across colleges. So we're not just talking about arts and science. It's not just about the humanities, but this is relevant to engineering, to business, and all the other kind of avenues of life. And I think that's, again, another thing that I was interested in creating the Institute, is not just being another humanities issue, or, oh, that's what you guys talk about in like the social science and humanities, so radical. It has nothing to do with STEM. It has nothing to do with these other, you know, kinds of pedagogies. So I think that's kind of how we're a little different, and what we're trying to build at Lehigh and work with these programs. And it's not necessarily separate. It's all about bringing us together at Lehigh and building together. So that's kind of what I would say from my perspective as a student, both undergrad and also graduate.
Yeah, thank you, Kebelis. And I really also want to add and emphasize what Marilisa said earlier about the Institute centering its work on anti-racism, anti-sexism, and anti-colonialism explicitly. I think this is something that is not done at Lehigh, and ethnic studies is really not area studies, which I think that's what Lehigh generally does, right? So area studies like Asian studies or you know, Latino studies, or Africana studies. I think our work doesn't grow out of emphasizing original content or original context of our work. It really centers the knowledge of populations that have been historically excluded. It dismantles systems of colonialism in knowledge creation and in knowledge across disciplines. So in a lot of ways, there are going to be ways in which we would work with Africana studies, for example. But again, Africana studies it's Africana studies, it's not ethnic studies, and there are important distinctions that we want to highlight. And so ethnic studies, I think, would strengthen, if anything, the existing programs in Lehigh by providing a more intersectional, a more deliberate investigation of how communities that have been historically excluded and marginalized, how systems of knowledge are created, and what kinds of knowledge is valued, and what kinds of knowledge that we, you know, what kind of training we give our students, and how it's applicable across disciplines. So Africana studies is in the College of Arts and Sciences. Ethnic studies is applicable in engineering, in businesses. It would be in the College of Health. Again, it focuses on anti-racism, anti-colonialism, anti-sexism, and it focuses on privileging the experiential knowledge of people who have been historically excluded and who have been oppressed by white supremacist forms of knowledge.
Excellent. Yeah, I think we were also trying to break down the barriers of the colleges, sort of like, you know, you guys over there, you guys talk about race, but, you know, race doesn't really have anything to do with engineering and health and that sort of thing. So I think my colleagues have really focused on that very well. I want to give a question. Oh, sure, absolutely.
Yeah, the experiential knowledge is really important. You know, as Gevalis said, I would add to that the intellectual knowledge and the legacy of many groups of people, because it's not just experiences. It's, you know, it's the intellectualism, the scholarly knowledge also that our communities have. That's important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, I think one of the things, in a lot of the meetings we've been in, I think I keep saying like intellectual, and I think to emphasize that we have our own methods and our own theories and our own frameworks, right, that have been a long legacy that have just been kept out. And when you center the lives and the knowledges of people of color, what happens, right? It changes. And I think you brought some of that out in your talk as well, like who says who, right? That sort of question. But I wanted to have a question directly for you, Dr. Nieto, from Edwin, asking if you could talk a little bit about sort of like the current attacks on anti-racism, critical race theory that have been kind of coming around, right? How do you see that? How do you think we as scholars should respond, especially for those who say that this is divisive, even, that ethnic studies is divisive, right?
Well, that it's un-American, right? Yeah. I think we need to really be prepared for this because it is the backlash that we're going to see. We're in this political moment also that is very tense, and we can't look away or shy away from these controversies. I think we need to take them, head on, to face them. And so now this push to do away with anti-racism training, and well, training is a word I've never liked, but that's a Paulo Freire thing. He said, we train dogs, we don't train people. But this anti-racism work now is being really attacked. And critical race theory is being really attacked. And universities are seen as the bastion of, special interests. So I think the important thing is to keep doing this work. That's what we have to do, to keep doing the work and not do it alone. I really think it's important to work with others to make it, building on the legacy that I talked about before of ethnic studies being more communal and more collective, more collaborative. So build on that and make sure that you work with others, some who are like you and some who are different from you, not only in, in your experiences, but in your knowledge as well, in your background, so that you can strengthen what ethnic studies is all about. And so think of collaborative relationships that need to be created. Because one of the criticisms of ethnic studies has been that it can too easily become a very rigid nationalism that doesn't allow others in. And I think we need to show that it can be, and it should be just the opposite, that having an ethnic studies program, a Puerto Rican studies program, let's say, needs to be more inclusive by reaching out to others who are not part of that group, to build alliances rather than shun alliances. And because otherwise those ethnic studies programs can become their own silos.
I have a question for Dr. Nieto. So you talked about your experience going to school and teaching at a school in the Bronx and Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And it reminded me a lot of like my experiences going to school where I'm from in the Bronx. So I was wondering like what advice you have for students who come from K through 12 schools that are underfunded and schools where they were disadvantaged in navigating higher education.
Oh, that is a great question. Quickly go find those spaces wherever you are, wherever you land in higher education, where you can be supported, so that you never feel that you are less than, so that you never feel that you don't belong, because now those spaces exist. And if they get into those spaces and they don't exist, help create them. That's how ethnic studies started, by students It was mostly students getting together and say, we don't see ourselves, like your poem, Alyssa. You know, where's my curriculum? That's what students were saying 50 years ago. Where's my curriculum? And so, you know, so if they land in those places where they, you know, that support doesn't exist, create the support, is what I would say. And never feel less than. Never feel that you don't belong. Sensación de poderío, remember.
Thank you. We gotta walk in like we own the place. I like that. I like that. I think we, you know, I think we got a little swag in the room. I think, you know, if this is the room.
But you know, not in an arrogant way, because that can, you know, that's not what I'm saying at all. But as if you really belong, as if, look, I am not an alien here. I belong here.
Belong here. So we have some questions that are, I think, interesting for us to think about, especially in our current moment. You know, we have the question of like, how has Afro-Latino studies challenged traditional notions? It's decoloniality in various departments, but you know, I think one of the things I'm looking at in that question, even in talking about like Latino studies, right, and ethnic studies as a whole, is who gets left out, right, of the different definitions that people have grown accustomed to, even in like a history of colonialism. And I know that in our particular community, I'm wondering if our students want to speak to this too, or Siri, but in our particular surrounding community, we have a lot of Afro-Latino students, you know, who come to our courses and feel that maybe it's the first time they read, you know, Pedro Pietri and or, you know, different types of authors that also identified as Black often, you know, and people kind of have a hard time seeing that, you know, that what does Latino mean? Oh, I thought it meant this. So I think that that's been an interesting thing for us as a whole, but I'm wondering if other people have thoughts about these sort of like identities that people are not used to or not as familiar with and are more and more important to making sure that we don't erase.
I just want to say something about that I mean, if people have these perceptions, it's because of the reality that they see. Look at you, look at me, and think of most of the Puerto Rican professors who you know. They look like us. They don't look like Siri, you know, they don't look like Evalis. And so I think that, you know, we have to use that light-skinned privilege, even if we don't identify with it, we have to learn how to use it in a powerful way to open the door for other people. Because we had nothing to do with the fact that others, you know, are not allowed in. And why did we get in? So surely, if we come from similar backgrounds, we come from poor backgrounds, from, you know, backgrounds where we didn't have all the resources that other people did, and yet why do we make it? And so I don't claim that this is because of me. I know that it is because of other circumstances, including light skin, and that I have to take account of that and realize it and work to change that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's hard for even us as within our communities to have the conversations about colorism, right? And about the importance of advocating in all these different spaces and sort of like not getting comfortable with a particular definition. And I know for me in Latino literature and children's literature, really, you know, when Elizabeth Acevedo's book, right, The Poet X won the Pura Belpre Award, it was an amazing thing, but it was actually one of the first times a Black, you know, Dominican won an award that was also named after a Black woman, because Pura Belpre was a Black Puerto Rican. And we've kind of gotten so accustomed to, you know, this definition of Latino as very light skinned, and we've left out a lot of what our actual foundation has been, and those people who have advocated for us, and how foundational they are, even in Latino studies as a whole. I would say, and of course, African American studies, right? Schomburg often gets put in the African American reader, and we forget that he was Puerto Rican. So this is something I think that our current institutions are battling and are not, we need to advocate for more Black faculty, including more Black Latino faculty, right? More, and also Indigenous as well, because we know we have Afro-Indigenous scholars that often get erased from that narrative. So I think that was a really interesting question for us to think about. Sorry, I didn't mean to mute myself. I'm just looking at some of the questions we have here. I think we've answered a lot of the questions that are in that chat, and I'm just wondering if maybe another one of us has a question for Dr. Nieto. No, I'm going to ask you a question, and maybe that will be like how we can close if you're okay with that. So what do you think of, why do you think we keep having, you just mentioned that, something like Alisa's poem, right, was something that people were saying even 50 years ago. Why do you think that it's still something that our students are saying? Why do you think we're still sort of in this position that we still can't see ourselves in the curriculum? I guess, what would you answer to that?
I would say, why do we still see depictions of Jesus Christ as a white man with blonde hair and blue eyes? That has been going on for a couple of thousand years. And so the fact that what we lived through 50 years ago is still happening, it's because of what Frederick Douglass said: power concedes nothing without a fight. It never has, and it never will. That fight can take many different forms. It doesn't always have to be, what we went through in the early stages of ethnic studies, of taking over buildings, and it can be strengthening your intellectual abilities. That's a fight, and so I think it's because power doesn't concede anything. This is, what I talked about before, the powerful vested interests that exist in higher education as in everywhere else. And so we need to try to work within that structure while also challenging that structure.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Nieto. I don't know if anyone has another question for Dr. Nieto. Siri, you went away for a little bit, so I wasn't sure. I want to make sure that I don't ignore a question that you might have. You do?
No, I don't.
Okay. Well, I was thinking on that note that the struggle continues and that we have to continue to fight for these spaces where we are. And understanding too that we love our university, right? We love Lehigh, and like I said earlier today, or earlier in the opening, that we are Lehigh, and we want to see this university become a better place for our students of color and our faculty of color, so that it can retain our faculty of color especially, and see them through to full professor, to all the different positions that are available. And we came up with this idea, and we thank you for watching us here. Thank you, Dr. Nieto, for being here and being part of our story. It's an honor. And thank you to each of you who are here that are our story, and our story and our legacy that continues, right? We continue writing the story as we keep going. And something I wanted to say too, we do have a website that you can visit. We can make that available to you later in the link. And then also we focus on education justice and health justice at the moment. So those are our two sort of arms, faculty arms. But obviously, as we keep growing, we want to emphasize different things that different researchers would bring. We are also hiring students to do work for us. So we have quite a few research positions that are opening up in terms of building our data center. So please keep a lookout for those. We will be advertising those. Follow us on social media. at Studies Group on Twitter and at Lehigh Ethnic Studies on Instagram. And I know Dr. Nieto, you as well have a website, right? Is it sonianieto.com?
Yes.
Where we can find your books and a couple of your talks as well, I think are available there. So we thank you so much. We thank each of the panelists as well, my colleagues, salute you. We're not gonna retire after this though, right? We've been talking about this for such a long time. It's like, wait, what happened? You know, we did this. No, la lucha sigue. We have work to do, obviously. Thank you so much for the day that you spent with us, Dr. Nieto. And we look forward to learning more from our colleagues here and to hearing what other things you have to say in terms of questions you have for us in the future and support our work. Thank you. Good night.